makes me squirmy and uncomfortable often enough. But anyway, that said, that's where we're going. Let's pray as we get into this. Father, your word is life and hope. Your law is perfect and good. And when you call us into new things or you challenge us away from old things, it's for our good that you have in mind. And so we pray that as we read and understand your word this morning, that you would be speaking, changing, drawing our hearts into you. Help us to trust you with them. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so today we're going to look at Jesus' words on two pretty controversial topics, adultery and divorce. And I want to acknowledge right off the bat again that I'm aware that there are a number of people in our church right now who have waded through or are wading through this complicated, painful, and messy world. I've never spoken to somebody going through a divorce that's like, this is fun. I really like this thing. And I understand that this is really painful. However, if we are going to take Jesus' words today as seriously as he would like us to, I suspect that we'll pretty soon find that this message is not just for married or divorced persons, but for every single one of us. And to that end, if you're feeling uncomfortable today, I want you to know that you are welcome here. You are right in the right crowd of people. A bunch of sinners learning to trust Jesus with our next steps. I didn't write this sermon to anybody in particular. It just comes next in our study on the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm confident that Jesus' words here need to be heard by all of us. C.S. Lewis, in his book, Mere Christianity, devotes 2 separate chapters to sexual morality and to Christian marriage. And at the beginning of his chapter on Christian marriage, he offers 2 reasons that he's reluctant to deal with the topic. The first being because that in his day, Mere Christianity being published in 1952, he said that Christian doctrines on marriage were extremely unpopular. That was in 1952, though. And the second was because he had never been married himself, and so he had this sort of natural hesitancy that accompanies that kind of humility. Today, more than 70 years after Mere Christianity's publication, Christian doctrines on marriage are super popular. You're supposed to laugh there. They're not. They haven't become more popular with time. And while Lewis's lack of practical experience in marriage may have given him some hesitancy, I find that my recently celebrated 16 years of marriage produced in me a similar kind of hesitancy to stand up here and proclaim the foundations of a perfect union, lest anybody look too closely at my own. So, with all of the historical unpopularity of the topic that we have experienced and that this topic has experienced, I don't think we would be too surprised to find a similar dynamic when Jesus addresses the issue 2,000 years ago. Jesus taught in a world just as divided as our own over these critical matters, and the same ones that our world divides over today. There are various schools of thought on divorce within Judaism, and the Judaism that was being kind of figured out was in the context of the larger cultural context of the Greco-Roman world, which is still depicted in movies and media today for its not so biblical views on morality and sexuality, much less divorce. And so the Jews in Jesus' day are divided on how to handle divorce, what might constitute a godly reason or justification for divorce, if that exists, and when or if one could be remarried after divorce. And Jesus offers some pretty challenging wisdom in our passage today from Matthew 5, and later on in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 19. He kind of gets into this in 2 different places, where he's going to weigh in more directly on the debate in chapter 19 in response to some fairly direct questions from the Pharisees. But to begin with, I want to read our whole passage from Matthew 5, 27 to 30. It says this. This is Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 all the way down to 32, actually. It says, and once we read through that, we're going to get into kind of the specific historical significance that the teachings would have had, and then hopefully kind of analyze our own culture, our own moment, our own understanding in light of that. So this is what Jesus says in Matthew 5, verse 27. He says, "You've heard it said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. it is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. He goes on, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. In these teachings, much like his previous teaching on murder, Jesus recasts some of these old moral laws from the Torah, from the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And he recasts these old laws under the lens of their original intended outcome of interchange. And he says, from the commandment, do not murder, we get, don't actually even be angry, but be a peacemaker instead. He's giving us the positive thing to put in the place of that would make these rules unnecessary, right? From do not commit adultery, we get, don't even allow your heart to go on looking lustfully at a woman. And the anger leading to murder puts you in danger of the fire of hell, he tells us. And here we find that it would be better to cut off the offending part of your body than to subject your whole body to hell. Both of these teachings, all of these teachings so far, intensify the moral claim of the law from mere outward obedience to this inward transformation. I actually want to start this morning at the bottom half of that verse with Jesus' teaching on divorce, which according to Jesus is rooted in the sin of adultery, which according to the first part of the passage is actually a lust issue, right? So we have divorce happens because of adultery, and all divorce is adultery, he says, except for in the case of sexual immorality. And then all adultery, as he establishes earlier on, is actually a lust issue. The problem with it is that we first are looking lustfully. So in this sense, divorce is like the flower of the dandelion, and adultery and lust are that long, fragile root that Jesus is so thoroughly trying to eradicate and dig out. So we'll notice right away that Jesus is speaking to men, actually, when he speaks about divorce. Anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce, he says. And this is because in Jesus' day, women were not actually able to divorce their husbands. I put wives, but that's not true. They weren't allowed to do that either in Jesus' day. Women were not allowed to divorce their husband, which is largely still true, actually, inside of Judaism. This places the woman in a pretty vulnerable position. It's hard to get out of an abusive relationship if your husband won't write you a certificate of divorce. And because you're not officially divorced, you're unable to remarry, which means you have no economic recourse, no support. You can also appreciate that while this creates a fairly vulnerable place for the lady, it also creates a place of relative power for the man. The law Jesus is referring to is here found in Deuteronomy chapter 24, which says essentially, and I'm paraphrasing this, but you can look it up, that a man can divorce a woman, quote, who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her. A literal translation of that word indecent, something indecent, is actually finds a naked thing about her. And it's a confusing one for people to translate because that's the Hebrew on it, right? Is a thing of nakedness or a naked thing, which is interpreted variously by the rabbis because we don't get a lot of cases of them talking about this, using this in other contexts that would help us understand what they mean by that. And so the rabbis have to do some interpretive work, and there becomes a few different positions that are available. Some would say that some nakedness or a naked thing is that she has maybe exposed herself or was naked with another person, i.e. like adultery or sexual immorality or etc. What the NIV seems to favor in the translation as indecent or shameful act is kind of the second position, is that the husband may issue a certificate of divorce for a thing of nakedness, which is to say she behaves in like an immodest or unrefined way. You know, instead of refining it, putting clothes on it, making it look nice, it's just kind of like, out there, a naked thing, embarrassing, crass, whatever. So the rabbis would argue over this. The famous debate was between Hillel and Shammai, and then also Rabbi Akiva, with a third position, focus on her becoming displeasing to him, which is what it says earlier on in that little chunk of Deuteronomy 24. If she just becomes displeasing to him because of whatever naked thing. So this would become like any and everything. and it would become the basis for divorce. Even famously citing that if she burned your meal or repeatedly burned your food, that she could be issued a certificate of divorce. So, as you can see, the responses vary from infidelity to just kind of displeasure, but generally speaking, they put the man's happiness at the center of that union and also at the center of that woman's security. So if he ain't happy, then she's not secure. Now, these three interpretations of the law of Moses refer back to a concession that had to be made within the law because God's original design for marriage was already broken. Already, back way thousands of years before all of this, right? The Pharisees are aware of the various interpretations that are surrounding the topic, and they want to trap Jesus. So in Matthew 19, if you turn there, you can, you don't have to. But in Matthew 19, a little after Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, as he's going on through his ministry, they corner him and they want to figure out, okay, Jesus, you give us your position on this particular topic. I want to know what you think about it. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason, they say? Now, most of us would know instinctively exactly how Jesus would answer that question. If we were Jesus, we'd go, well, no, it's not okay to divorce your wife for any and every reason. That's ridiculous. And you and I might think that his response should be simple no. But if he says that, Jesus becomes divided. He's going to divide himself from one of the three main schools of interpretation in Jewish thinking. And this is something that people get, as you could imagine, pretty staunch about because they've staked their lives on the decisions that they've made and the interpretations that they've taken. So as we saw in earlier sermons, Jesus has a very eclectic group of followers. These 12 disciples that are with him represent all kind of forms of thinking, right? And the trap the Pharisees are laying is sadly a really common abuse of theology and religion, which apparently is a really old trick. Because it would have Jesus take a position and then so divide his followers accordingly, right? They're using theology just to create division. They're like trying to trap him into this thing and then cancel him. But Jesus doesn't take the bait. He zooms the picture back out and he reminds them of the unity which God created us to enjoy from the very beginning, and that Moses' command was not so much a command as it was a concession that came about, not as a positive commandment, but as a sort of necessary amendment on account of the hardness of human hearts. Divorce laws and all of these things wouldn't be necessary if we could actually just experience the marriage that God wants for us, that he desires for us, and that we desire to have. And then after he says that, he repeats his teaching from the Sermon on the Mount, saying, anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Essentially what Jesus is saying is no. I mean, yes, you may issue a certificate of divorce for any and every reason, but every reason other than sexual immorality is actually just adultery on the man's part. Because that man ought to be protecting his wife, not feeding his restlessness and shopping around because he has the power and capacity to do so. He actually has the power to love, honor, and cherish her. And a heart that desires anything beyond that is already adulterous. See the turn? Jesus ruthlessly goes after the heart of the matter, which is always a matter of the heart. That little turn of phrase is indebted to Dallas Willard, who wrote that in the book once. It's worth noting that this kind of restlessness isn't limited to married folk either. This is true for single people as well. In the same way that a single unmarried person that sleeps with somebody else's wife is equally culpable in the act of adultery taking place, so too, once adultery is a matter of the heart, the single folk find that they have something to guard in their hearts as well. They have a responsibility here. They're being called into something. The habits that we develop regarding what we're looking for in a potential spouse are actually going to shape our heart toward our future spouse. Do we expect Mr. or Mrs. Perfect? I remember growing up, my friend Al, he said his wife was going to be smoking hot, a child of God, and would need to be able to pilot an Apache helicopter. That was his criteria. And we were like, good luck, Al. And it took him a long time to get married, but thankfully by the time that he did meet his wife, which did take a while, he had relaxed the ridiculous ones of those expectations. But what we should be looking for in a spouse is really a person that we can love, honor, and protect for the rest of our lives. We're not looking for what they can give to us or what they can do for us or what we're going to get out of this thing, right? We're committing ourselves to love this person for the rest of our lives. Christian marriage vows speak of, sickness and health, for better or for worse, good and bad times, all of this kind of stuff. And they do that. We write that stuff into our vows in an expectation that our spouse is actually not going to fulfill us, but rather that we're going to be let down and disappointed occasionally. That it's going to be hard. And that when it is hard and when we are let down, that we're going to continue to love them with the love God has given us as children of God. Abandoning this commitment in the pursuit of our competing desires for fulfillment or understanding or what we think we owe ourselves or what we deserve actually make us guilty of adultery, even if we only abandon them in our hearts, stalking our exes on Facebook or oogling the other one when we're walking down the street and we think they can't see us, or indulging in pornography and the like, or for women, I suppose, is often exposed in the place where the heart goes when watching rom-coms or reading fantasy romance novels. I mean, after all, which wife turns away from a steamy romance novel, looks over at their dad-bod husband drinking a beer on the couch, and then just goes like, my husband is so much better than that guy in the book, right? The heart has turned away. The heart's turned away already. And that's why Jesus reminds us in the earlier passage that this lust for the other thing that despises the current thing, is the real issue behind adultery. When he says, anyone who looks lustfully at a woman has already committed adultery with her in his heart. That word, look lustfully, I can't remember the verb. I'm not great with the grammar, but it's one of those, it's the ing word, right? So it's like a gerund infinitive. That's what it is. So it's continuing to happen. Leanne, am I right about that? Do you know? It's the infinitive. What's that? What did you say? Oh, sorry. It's the ing. It's the action that continues on into the present moment. You're still doing it. And so it would maybe perhaps be better translated as going on looking. Like continuing the glance, the stare, the stare down in the heart. Jesus tells us that this lustful looking reveals a really dangerous sickness of the heart. And the sickness of the heart is a danger to both our mortal and our eternal selves. Our eternal selves are of such importance, in fact, that Jesus says they are worth significantly more than, say, your right hand or your right eye. This inward eternal heart is what Jesus is constantly pursuing throughout the Sermon on the Mount. So it would seem that our hearts are full of adultery and lust, and because of this, our lives are doomed to pain and brokenness and broken relationships. But that's not quite where Jesus leaves us, thankfully. He says the problem is the heart, and while we can't deal with the heart, Jesus can. And when Jesus deals with our hearts, we will begin to form a godly view of the opposite sex, where we both begin to experience the promises originally attached to God's design for this thing. I would like to point out, first of all, something that might scandalize you. God created sex. It's his invention. And I'm pretty grateful that he did. I think he did a pretty good job with that. And it surprised a lot of people. I remember the summer after I think it was like my third year of Bible school, I was out working for the U.S. Forest Service in Idaho. And there was this girl that I sometimes worked with our crew, and everybody there knew I had been at Bible school. So, we had hours working in the woods, and we would just kind of talk about this stuff. Questions about the Bible would come up. But her question surprised me, but I do kind of think it was representative of a common misconception about sex in the Bible. She asked, why is it then, oh, smarty pants Bible school kid, if sex feels good and if we need it as a species to survive, would God make having sex sinful? And I was like, wait, what? That's not part of it, is it? But people often think of sex and religion like that. What people don't often think is that God created us with these parts specifically so that we could be fruitful and multiply. Not only does God not forbid us from having sex, he commands us to have it, and plenty of it, apparently. Of course, within what seems like not a whole lot of time at all after God creates Adam and Eve, we took this good thing and we perverted it by blowing it out of proportion or taking it out of its original God-given context of marriage. This is the point at which sex and lust turn into a conversation about marriage. God not only gives us intense pleasures, but he also provides a context within which to best enjoy those pleasures. The context for sex is marriage, a lifelong, committed relationship between a man and a woman. This is the one flesh that Jesus refers to again in Matthew 19. The very fact that marriage is the context within which to appreciate God's gift of sex means that, like, sex is placed inside of this larger context, right? Means that sex is subordinate to the things of marriage. It's not supposed to be raised to a place of prominence beyond marriage. Attempting the oneness of sex outside of the oneness of marriage is sinful, which means that it will not bring about the same kind of satisfaction or growth in us that it was intended to. Enjoying the pleasurable things that God gives us within their proper God-given context matters. Because when we do it, we understand better what is truly most pleasurable, meaningful, and significant in life. Every departure from that or perversion of it is actually a privation of the good thing that God desires for us and will limit our experience of God's goodness. Our lives are worse when we disobey, when we walk away from what God has for us. But these desires are actually not ends in themselves. God gave us these desires that through those desires, we might increase our desire for the way things are actually supposed to be, which is to say, heavenly. It would be good, I think, if we could all get the picture of cherubs and clouds and harps and gray-haired old men out of our head when we think about heaven. Because heaven is this place where all of our desires are rightly ordered and subordinated. All of our fears and insecurities are erased. It's the place where God dwells with his people, where there's harmony and reconciliation. It's the place where the justice that we long for is found. It's lived out. It defines our everyday experience, and where we don't have to worry about the abuse of power or about corruption or about inequality. Once we begin to shift our understanding of heaven in this way, we begin to recognize our longing for heaven in all kinds of things. And this is what Jesus is talking about when he's bringing in the kingdom of heaven. When he's announcing the kingdom of heaven, he's announcing the righting of all of the wrong things, and he's bringing the joy back into creation that has been stolen from it through sin. But once we begin to see these desires pointing to our longing for heaven, we begin to see it in all kinds of stuff. We see it reflected in the beautiful things. You'll probably recognize something of it in the sunrise or in the sunset, where it draws your heart upward and outward, and you go, there's bigger, more beautiful things that we're a part of. There's something that's not broken in this world that we get to participate in. You'll see it in children playing peacefully. You don't know quite exactly what it is there, but it's there, right? You'll get glimpses of it at work when things are working well, when the team is working together to accomplish big things. You're like, yeah, that's good. Right? And you'll see it in marriage and even in sex. But in getting that little glimmer, you'll actually never quite lay hold of that thing, right? It's hard to embrace this thing, to grab it, to own it, to like wrap it up and put it in your backpack and take it with you. Because the kingdom of heaven isn't actually limited, though, to just these beautiful things. And it's still coming. It's something that we look forward to. It's the hope that's inside of our hearts. But it's not actually limited to just beautiful things, because when we talk about hope, we talk about hoping for something that is not yet, right? What we don't yet have, but we know is there. It's the longing of our hearts. It's the sense of justice that you've actually been depraved of. It's our longing and the ache that we experience around death, which is actually a longing for heaven, that all of this stuff wouldn't be just temporary and passing away, and so fraught with pain and hardness and brokenness. And it's our commitment that we know that it's actually not this way, that death is something abnormal that shouldn't be, but that heaven is. And in this way, our longings turn our hearts and our minds and our eyes heavenward through brokenness. In holding the broken things, we recognize with growing clarity those imposters that used to promise heaven. Those things which promised but couldn't ever quite deliver, right? We hear this often. I get a lot of people that I'll talk to that go, I started this job and it was so good. It's going to be the greatest job ever. Or when you're doing premarital counseling, right? They put a lot of weight on like this spouse is like the perfect person and our relationship is going to be my hope and it's my hope for happiness is on this thing. All of these things promise heaven, but they don't deliver. The perfect job, maybe it's the perfect holiday, the perfect sabbatical that you need in order to be perfect and well and good. It's the perfect spouse, the perfect church. None of these things actually exist. It's for this reason that we attach ourselves to movements. We want to be a part of this thing that goes, I know that this brokenness is not right, and I want to champion the right thing. And so we glom on to movements like Black Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter or Every Child Matters or all of these movements that say, not that, but this. Cry out imperfectly to some degree for that sense of justice or equality that'll one day be represented fully in the kingdom of heaven, where those movements are no longer necessary. But we have to be careful not to mistake the movement or the cry for the thing itself, for that thing that we actually desire. I want to quote C.S. Lewis here because he speaks powerfully to this subject throughout a lot of his works, directly and indirectly, but very specifically in his chapter on hope in Mere Christianity, he says, most people, if they had really learned to look into their own hearts, would know that they do want, and want acutely, something that cannot be had in this world. There are all sorts of things in this world that offer to give it to you, but they never quite keep their promise. It's the longings which arise in us when we first fall in love or first think of some foreign country or first take up some subject that excites us. Are longings which no marriage, no travel, no learning can really satisfy. I'm not now speaking of what would be ordinarily called unsuccessful marriages or holidays or learned careers. I'm speaking of the best possible ones. There was something we grasped at in that first moment of longing which just fades away in the reality. And then he goes on to list 3 common attempts to reconcile that tension, to go, what is it that we're desiring for? Why do we desire for this thing? The first attempt is to just keep adding up more of the same, to just keep adding more holidays or marriages or whatever. He calls this the fool's approach. Keep hunting. Folks in this category return disappointed from their perfect holiday, or they become disillusioned with their perfect marriage and they go on repeatedly trying to make it work. New, more expensive holidays and new, more expensive spouses. The second solution, Lewis calls the way of the disillusioned, sensible man, who sees that nothing can actually make him happy. And so after multiple failures in all of these places, he becomes embittered against the whole thing. And these tired cynics are typical, the grumpy old guy or whatever, tired of life and having exhausted all of its fleeting promises, surrenders eventually to their own cynicism. That's a sad place to go. But the final approach is what Lewis calls the Christian approach. And I'll just quote from him here. He says, the Christian says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger? Well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim? Well, there's such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire? Well, there's such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Consider it. If I find in myself a desire which nothing in this world can satisfy, that goes beyond all of that, if we've exhausted all those common areas that we've been looking for it, and we can't find it, then maybe it is that we belong to another world. He goes on, if none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably, earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. If that is so, I must take care, on the one hand, never to despise or be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other, never to mistake them for the something else of which they are only a kind of copy or echo or mirage. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of life to press on to that other country and to help others to do the same. This is such a beautifully and powerfully worded thing. I return to this quote often because I'm reminded that this other country is so much better than this thing that we're doing, and we're actually trying to bring it here. Approached in this way, our desire, it doesn't hunger for satisfaction from earthly things. It's not looking to them. It's not looking, there's no job, no holiday, no church, no family, no spouse that's ever going to be able to satisfy that desire. Instead, as Jesus says, when the Christian hungers and thirsts for righteousness, they will be filled. So if we apply this thinking to Jesus' teaching today on adultery, we begin to see why lust, this desire to have another person, so quickly put a person at risk of hell. It's not because, not only does it objectify the other person, which is bad, right? But it actually rejects heaven, what Lewis calls the true country, which we will not find until after death, and demands satisfaction now. It says, I want that thing now. I don't care about heaven. And it turns away from heaven. It makes the fool's error, treating the earthly blessing like the true and final blessing it was meant to draw us into. And this sounds to me like hell on earth. And if you've inhabited this space for long or tried these things, or you know folks who have done so, looking from partner to partner, experience to experience, job to job, always finding something else to make them full and happy, I suspect your own experience will confirm the same. It's not heavenly. But if this is hell on earth, what Jesus' teachings are trying to show us is how through him we're able to bring heaven to earth, to announce the kingdom of heaven has come near. And for this to happen, we need more than rules and outward changes. We need a change of our heart, a new appetite, and to recognize the futility of the lust which leads to adultery, which, again, does not only apply to married folk, right? The married and the unmarried are equally capable of lust and of a feeding a new appetite for heaven. We still feel the hunger, but we have to look to something more satisfying. The refusal to hunger better is the reason that those who married with the expectation that their new spouse is going to satisfy all of their appetites so often turn to things like pornography or secret sexual fantasies or romance novels or whatever it is. They've already realized that their appetite and desire was far larger than their spouse could ever satisfy. I'm not saying this to shame anybody. Our culture has made this really difficult, like really hard. We've been promised in virtually every movie and every book and every instance of media that if we could just find the right person or the perfect expression of our sexuality or our identity, that we would be happy. And it sells because we're willing to pay a lot for that kind of fulfillment. But are we willing to pay what it's worth? Are we willing to pay what Jesus is asking us? Are we willing to surrender not just our beliefs and our money, but our hearts? Are we willing to give those to Jesus, our deep inner longing, over to the lordship of Jesus and say, Jesus, you tell me how to long. You tell me how to hunger. You tell me how to feed this hunger that I have inside of me. What if we said, Lord, you created me with an intense desire, a desire to be known and satisfied that no earthly thing or person is ever truly going to be able to satisfy. So instead of looking to them, I want to look to you. I want to hunger not for happiness or satisfaction or the perfect expression of my sexual identity. I want to hunger instead for heaven, for righteousness, for your kingdom to come, and for your will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. Lord, you know my deepest desire. It's the desire that's under our other desires. You gave me these lesser desires that I might glorify and honor you with them. And then just say, God, will you show me how to do it? Will you teach me to desire you? I want you to imagine what this kind of prayer would do to you. That's the kind of prayer that messes a person up. Imagine how it might shape your heart. Imagine the kind of self-sacrificial love you might become capable of. Imagine how that might shape your marriage, your family, your church, your children, your job, your friendships, your ability to enjoy the most pleasurable things in a way that releases them from your need to be fully satisfied by them and just says, God is my satisfaction, and these things draw me into him. It would give us a chance to experience the most pleasurable things in a way that draws us closer to heaven every time, rather than leading to that disillusionment and frustration that leads to cynicism. I really believe that if the church, our church, we could believe this, could subordinate our desires in this way to the lordship of Jesus, and through that submission just trust God, not just with salvation, not just with like our theological doctrines and whatever, but with our very satisfactions, with the things that make us happy, that we turn to for completion and fulfillment. I really believe that Christ Church would become a group of amazing ambassadors for the gospel of Jesus. And yes, it would be countercultural, but not in the way that pushes our secular culture away, but in the way which invites them with us into a deeper kind of joy that nothing else in the world